everyone, this is Tian Inside. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from the book of Numbers, chapters 18 and 19. Now, what we're looking at here is basically a divine blueprint, a guide for how an entire community could live right in the presence of a holy God. And it covers everything, everything, from job roles to a really unique economy and even some pretty mysterious purification rituals.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the holy division of labor. Then we'll dive into this fascinating economic promise called the Salt Covenant and a system known as the Tithe of the Tithe. And then we're going to get into one of the most mysterious rites in the whole Bible, the red heifer ritual and the water of purification that came from it. All right, let's jump right in.
All right, first up, a holy division of labor. You have to imagine this, right? When a holy God is literally dwelling in the middle of your nation, you can't just have a free-for-all. No way. You need structure. A really clear structure was absolutely crucial for anyone serving in or around the tabernacle. So this whole structure was basically built around two groups. First, you've got the priests. These are the direct descendants of Aaron, and their job was right at the heart of worship. We're talking serving at the altar, handling all the offerings, mediating for sin, the really central stuff. And then you had all the other Levites. You can think of them as the essential support team. They were in charge of taking care of and even moving the entire tabernacle. So they helped the priests, but, and this is a big but, the roles were not interchangeable. There was a very strict boundary there, all to protect the holiness of that central sanctuary. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a job description. The text actually calls the priesthood a gift. And you can see why, right? It was this incredible privilege to get to serve that close to God's presence, to be the ones mediating between God and the entire nation. So this role, it wasn't really defined by labor. It was defined by this immense honor and, of course, a ton of responsibility. Okay, so that brings up a really practical question, doesn't it? If the priests and Levites are doing this full time, how do they, eat? How do they support their families? They weren't given any land like the other tribes. And the answer to that leads us to something called the Salt Covenant. And the solution was it was both simple and really profound. God himself was going to be their inheritance. Think about it. They were essentially employed directly by God. So their provision, their paycheck, if you will, came directly from him through the offerings the people brought. They had no other job, so this system was set up to take care of them and their families completely. So why call it a salt covenant? What's with the salt? Well, in the ancient world, salt was a huge deal. It was a preservative, right? It stopped things from rotting, and it was super valuable. So when two parties made a deal, a covenant, they'd often share salt. It was a symbol that their agreement was permanent, that it would never spoil or change. And that's what made this salt covenant so powerful. By using that image, God was making it crystal clear that his promise to provide for the priests was permanent. It was an unbreakable, unchangeable promise, just as enduring and reliable as salt itself. Okay, so that takes care of the priests. But what about all the other Levites? Well, their support came from this really ingenious divine economy, a system built on something called the Tithe of the Tithe. Now, before we get into how that worked, let's just quickly define the core idea here. A tithe is just 10%, simple enough, but it was way more than just a number. It was a real act of faith. When the Israelites gave a tenth of their income, they were basically saying, we recognize that everything we have comes from God. So here's how the whole system flowed. Step 1. All the other tribes of Israel would give their tithe. That's 10% of all their crops, their income, everything, to the Levites. This was their inheritance. But it didn't stop there. Then came step 2. The Levites had to take a tenth of what they received and give that to the priests. That's the tithe of the tithe. And on paper, this system should have been more than enough. Look at the population difference. It's huge. The rest of the Israelites outnumbered the Levites by about 50-1. So a 10% tithe from that many people? Yeah, that should have been a very generous provision for the much smaller tribe that was dedicated to serving God. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This is where the perfect divine plan runs into messy human reality. Because historically, we see all these references to the Levites being poor. And that pretty much tells you that the people of Israel, they didn't always follow through. The system itself was perfect, but it all depended on the people actually doing what they were supposed to do. Okay, so we've covered the workforce and the economy that supported them. Let's switch gears a bit now and talk about the rules of purity for the whole community. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, mysterious rituals in the entire Bible, the red heifer.
The process for making these special purifying ashes was incredibly specific. I mean, meticulous. It all started with a perfect red heifer, and it had to be one that had never been used for work, never been yoked. After it was sacrificed, the priest would sprinkle its blood 7 times towards the tabernacle. Then the entire animal, flesh, skin, blood, everything was burned. And while it was burning, they added 3 symbolic things to the fire: cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn. Finally, all the ashes from this really unique ceremony were carefully gathered up and stored in a clean place.
And pretty much every single part of this ritual was just dripping with symbolism. The heifer's red color, that's meant to make you think of blood, which is the symbol of life. And the other things, the cedar, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, those were also seen as symbols of vitality and life. So here's the really amazing part. You're taking all these powerful symbols of life and combining them to create the ultimate cure for the spiritual contamination that comes from death. So, what were these ashes actually for? Well, they were the key ingredient in something called the water of purification. This was the special remedy used to cleanse people from a very, very specific kind of ritual uncleanness. You see, in this ancient worldview, death was seen as a major source of spiritual contamination. So if you touched a dead body, that was pretty obvious. You became unclean. But the impurity actually spread. Just being in a tent where someone had died made you unclean. Touching any uncovered bowl or pot in that same tent, yep, that made you unclean too. Basically, any contact with death, direct or indirect, meant you needed to be purified. So to make the actual cleansing solution, they'd take a small amount of those red heifer ashes and mix them with what the text calls living water. Now, that most likely means fresh running water, from a spring or a river, which of course is another powerful symbol of life. And the way they applied it was just as specific. A person who was already clean would dip a hyssop branch into this water and then sprinkle it on the unclean person, or the tent, or whatever it was. And it wasn't a one-and-done kind of thing. The sprinkling had to happen twice, once on the 3rd day and then again on the 7th day. Only then was the purification complete. And let me tell you, the stakes here were incredibly high. If you were unclean and you just ignored this purification process, that wasn't just a personal problem. It was seen as an act that actually defiled the Lord's holy sanctuary itself. In their world, one person's impurity could affect the spiritual health of the entire community and their connection with God. So when you kind of step back and look at the whole picture, you can really see this full divine blueprint taking shape. It's all interconnected. You've got the people, that special workforce of priests and Levites. You've got the provision, the whole divine economy of tithes that supported them. And you've got the purity, these really strict rules, like the red heifer ritual, designed to maintain holiness for everyone. It really was a complete, holistic system for the entire community. Now, I know these ancient laws can feel really distant to us, but they were all designed to build a world that had real, tangible order and holiness. And that kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it? What principles for community, for how we support each other, and for purity? What can we learn from this that resonates even today? What does it take to build a community that's truly set apart?